Now, being able to accept inputs is one important feature and concept in Angular components because it allows you to reuse components with different data. But custom components also often need to emit custom events and not just accept inputs. So they need to produce outputs as well, you could say. And that's actually the situation we have in our app here as well. When I click a user, I want to soon show the tasks for that user here on the right. Now, of course, that tasks list or whatever it will not show up inside of the user component because the user component is really only responsible for outputting this user element. Therefore, the information that a user was clicked must get out of that user component and must be passed on to the app component in this app here. Because it's the app component that's outputting the user, and it's the app component that could then output the tasks of that user next to that unordered list. Here, for example. So we need to let the app component know when a user is clicked, so when the button in the user component is clicked. And we already have a click listener on that button, of course, but now we need to output the information that this button was clicked. And this can be done with help of another feature provided by Angular, output properties. To set up such a property, you can add another regular property and give it any name of your choice. For example, select, because we want to create kind of a custom select event, you could say. We want to pass the information that a specific user was selected to the component that's using the user component. So select sounds like a fitting name. And this select component must be decorated with another decorator that's imported from Angular, the output decorator. This is imported from @Angular core and then used just like input by executing it like this in front of the select property. Now, unlike an input, the select property will receive an initial value though, assigned with that equal sign. And that initial value is a new event emitter object, where event emitter is actually also imported from @Angular core. And this instance of the event emitter class we're creating here, so this event emitter object we're getting here in the end, will then allow us to emit custom values through that select property to any parent component that's interested. And for that here in onSelectUser, which is that function that's triggered when we click that button, in that function, in this method here, I want to use this select property to emit a new value. And now we just have to pass the value that should be emitted to this emit method, which is provided by that event emitter object, which is stored in select. Now we don't have to set a value here if we don't want to, but we of course can. And we might, for example, want to accept another input first, the ID of the user, let's say, which should also be a string, because in my dummy users, every user has such a string ID. And that should also be required. And then we can convince TypeScript with that exclamation mark that it is. And now we could emit this ID here in onSelectUser because we receive it as an input and we pass it back to the parent component whenever a user is selected. Now we have to go back to the app component and of course set the ID here and set it to users 0 ID on the first user, and then copy and paste this to all other users and access the other indexes of those users. And I'll now press that format document shortcut to make this code look a bit prettier. And we can now also listen to our custom event here, because that's the other thing we added. We added this select output, and with that added, we can use event binding on our custom component to listen for this select event, because we in the end now did create our own custom event called select. And we can now handle this just as we can handle any built-in event. We can add a method to the app component, which could be called onSelectUser. The name, of course, is up to you though. And here we then expect to get the ID of that user. Now, if I just add the ID parameter like this, I'm again getting a complaint by TypeScript though, because the parameter ID implicitly has the AnyType. So that's a similar problem as we faced before, because in the end the problem here is that TypeScript doesn't know which type of value we'll get here, and it wants to know because it is its main thing. Therefore, just as before with those properties here, we have to tell TypeScript which kind of value will be received here in this method by adding a colon and by then adding the type that we'll get here, in this case a string type. And now with that, TypeScript is happy, and here for the moment we can simply console log selected user with ID and then output that ID that we're receiving, like this, for example. Now with that added, it's this onSelectUser method which I want to set as a value for my custom select event, like that. However, now of course I'm getting an error here because onSelectUser expected one argument but got 0. I'm not passing anything here yet. And the value I do want to pass here to onSelectUser, of course, should be the ID that is emitted by this user component. But how do we now get hold of that emitted value here in the template of the app component? Well, you can get hold of emitted values with help of a special variable that's provided by Angular, the $event variable. That's a reserved name. It's a variable provided by Angular in its templates, or specifically in the parts where you handle events in your templates. So for example, here between the quotes of this event binding. And this $event variable will then hold the data, the value that was emitted by the event you're listening to. And with that, we therefore then are able to handle that event. And now, of course, we can copy and paste that to all the other app user components as well. And with that done, if we save everything and we open those developer tools here, if I click on a user, you see that I get this output selected with user ID U1. For the second user, I get U2, and so on. So this is working, and this therefore is how you can emit your own events with help of output, and how you can then handle them and also get access to the emitted data. So you did now learn how to add outputs to your components, custom events, so to say. Now, using this addOutput decorator is how you would create outputs in most Angular projects, and is the approach you'll see in most Angular projects, since this is how you've always created outputs in Angular. But there actually is a more modern alternative, which you might not encounter in that many projects, but which might become more important in the future, which is why I also want to introduce you to that. And that alternative does not use this output decorator, but instead an output function, which you must import from @Angular core. Now, this output function might look familiar to you if you recall that input function which we imported and used earlier to set up signal-based inputs, so to replace that @input decorator. Now we're doing something similar with this output function. And the idea is that instead of defining a custom event, a custom output like this, you still add your property, select in this case, but instead of adding @output in front of it, you assign the result of calling the output function to it. This syntax will tell Angular that select should be an output, just as the @output decorator does, and that it should, under the hood, in the end store such an event emitter. So you don't need to explicitly create that event emitter on your own anymore when using output, but it's instead done for you. Which means that you're still able and that you still should call emit on this output property, so on this select property. This still works because under the hood it still stores such an event emitter inside of it, just one that's automatically created by calling output. Now, one error I do get here is that the argument of type string, so the type of this ID, is not assignable to a parameter of type void, which might look a bit weird. Now, this is in the end TypeScript complaining about the type of data we're emitting here. We did not get this error when using the other approach where we created the event emitter ourselves, but when using this output function, Angular and TypeScript are a bit more strict. In the end, what we have to do here is let TypeScript know about the kind of data that will eventually be emitted. And we do that by again using this strange angle bracket syntax here. And between those angle brackets, we then set the type of value that will be emitted. In this case, string. And with that, the error goes away. So by using this generic type feature here, by letting TypeScript know about the type of value this output function will operate on, so the type of value that will be emitted in this case, TypeScript is happy again. And you can therefore then use this code, this approach here, instead of setting up the output like this. Now, what's really important to understand is that output is really just a replacement for this code. It does exactly the same in the end, and therefore you listen to custom events created with this output function in exactly the same way as if you were using that decorator. So in that app component template, we still use event binding like this to trigger the onSelectUser method whenever that select event occurs. That works in the same way. It's also important to understand that this output function does not create any kind of signal or anything like that. Select is in the end still an event emitter thing here. It's not a signal, unlike the input function, which did create an input signal. Output doesn't. It still just gives us a custom event we can emit. Now, why does this function exist then, if it does the same as this code, essentially? Well, mostly so that if you were using the input function for registering the inputs instead of that input decorator, that if you were doing that, you could use the output function so that you don't need any decorators at all, neither for inputs nor for outputs inside of that component. Besides the component decorator, you still need that. But no decorators would be needed inside of that component then. That's one reason for the existence of this function. In addition, this code, of course, is shorter than this code, and that's also a good reason to use this code, this syntax here. Nonetheless, just as with inputs earlier in this section, in most Angular projects, you will see the @output decorator and this manually created event emitter instead, simply because this approach has been around forever since Angular was released, whereas this output function is relatively new, and hence you won't encounter it in that many projects out there. And that's also why I will not use it here, why I instead will go back to the output decorator, but of course you should know about this output function And you'll also see it again throughout this course.